To Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club. I'm Will Acoma, an accomplished fabricator and machinist, and this is my associate Tobias Berblinger, an industrial designer and musician, and together we have a number of curious and exciting topics to share with you.
Our series highlights an eclectic group of speakers, experiences, and workshops across a broad range of subjects dictated by a curatorial interest in the areas of culture, design, science, technology, art, fabrication, and design techniques, and lost common knowledge. Today's presentation will be video streamed on the Core 77 blog alongside any presentation materials the speaker chooses to bring. Follow the lecture period. There will be a question and answer session as time allows.
As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you are now all members provided you adhere to our philosophy. Ex curiositas scientia. We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice.
This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungry for more. With that, we are pleased to introduce our speaker, Chance Walte, who runs a full-service shop called Fearless Guitars, dedicated to high-quality guitars, gear, and personal attention to customers' needs.
Thank you.
When do we learn the handshake?
First, you have to weather the shock first. So first off, how many people here either own a guitar, have owned a guitar, or have thought at one time about owning a guitar? Okay, fair enough. Well, I'm going to try and go sort of over the idea about how this works as a system. You could spend endless time talking about which magnets people prefer, what was hip about what happened in the 50s, which tone woods. What I want to look at is just sort of the idea about how all these different things are a couple of basic systems, a couple of basic big things that are happening, how those sort of integrate to form the character of the guitar, the playability of the guitar, the response of the guitar, your experience of the guitar, and what you can do to help make your experience of the guitar better, make your guitar work better for you, or choose possibly a better guitar for you the next time that you choose a guitar. And so, first off, you have to ask why an electric guitar if you're going to play any kind of an instrument. You know, they are iconic and totemic, and they're new, and they're versatile. They're just cool. And they're a wonderful lens for looking at the difference between something that's complicated and something that's complex, because obviously this is not terribly complicated. You got a couple of pieces of wood, you got some wire that you can't see that's going around like that. You got a very, very simple circuit here. That is a wonderful example of a functional guitar type instrument that is even less complicated in some respects, although the fretting system is really different and very interesting. But getting this to be something that is just magical, that does exactly what you want it to do, that just lets whatever you want to express fly out, is extraordinarily complex and can last your whole life mucking around and spending money and buying 30 guitars like somebody owned up to already, and that number would be much higher, sadly, for me. So it's a wonderful lens for looking at that idea and for exploring the ideas of balance, because everything in this little simple world, you add a little bit here and you're either taking away from something that's happening in another part, or you have to account for it in another part. And so those are two really great concepts, you know, for just sort of thinking in general about life and about whatever you're working on. So it can be a very philosophical thing to work on guitars and mess around with them as well. The first thing is tension. Depending upon how fierce you string your guitar, you're looking at between 95 and 130 pounds of tension right off the bat. So you can imagine this, that most guitar necks spec out to being about an inch thick stock. If you clamp an inch thick piece of wood that's 18 or 20 inches long on a table and you put 100 pounds on the end of it, that wood is just going to go, oh, help, help, and start to bend and contort and compress and do all kinds of things. So the first thing you're dealing with is a lot of tension. So you've got a rod in here called the truss rod, a lot of different types of truss rods, but the basic idea is you're compressing either two rods, a leaf spring kind of thing, a couple of different ways of doing it, but you've got something that is helping the neck battle against the strings. So naturally the strings are going to want to pull the neck this way, truss rod pulls it back. So the first thing you have to do is deal with that equation and get the neck relatively straight And the way that that all fits into how the guitar performs for you is if you've got too much curve, you've got the strings winning, all the energy of the strings is going into making that curve happen, not into exciting the body, not into resonance. If you get it too straight, then you have nowhere for the strings to wag around when you hit them, and you get buzz in the middle of the neck. So somewhere in between a perfectly straight neck, which would energize the body to the greatest degree and create the best tone, and something with a whole bunch of bow where you probably couldn't get it to buzz at all in the middle, but would have a very dull, rubbery, thuddy sort of a tone. Somewhere in there is this magic speck. And of course, again, it's going to be different for every person, because if I hit the strings really hard, I need more room for them to move around. If I have a very, very delicate touch, I can run it much more straight. That's a big, big deal. Blues guys, they want a lot of room to whack those strings. People that do a lot of jazz and shredding want a very, very flat fingerboard. Hugely different even on the same guitar. Same guitar is going to feel really different to two different people. So that also talks a lot about how you're energizing the wood of the body. Bigger strings, more tension, more impact into the body, potentially more resonance. Good up to the point where you can't manipulate the strings anymore. Doesn't do you any good. There are a lot of articles on, and people that are very staunch adherents to bigger strings equal bigger tone. Great and true up to the point where you can't get the string to do what you want it to do. You can't, very many people can't do oblique 3-string Nashville bends like really hot Telecaster players if they've got 12s on their guitar. So obviously bigger strings are going to make more happen, but if you can't actually articulate in the way that you want to, you're not getting anything to happen that you want to begin with. That also happens with the size of the neck. A bigger neck is going to impart more resonance into the body. It's going to fight against the strings harder, but at the point where you can't reach around and actually do what you want to, what's the point of playing the instrument? So there again is that whole balancing situation. Can I play a bigger string to get more tone out of it? Where's that part that I stop? Can I handle a bigger neck to get a richer, deeper tone, or where's the point that I stop? The magic in the guitars, the sort of name of the discussion, the idea is that when all these things sort of balance out and you know what you want out of the guitar, and you either achieve it yourself or have somebody that you dialogue with that can help you, then you have that sensation of, wow, nothing is buzzing, everything's happening, I can reach down and control the tone and get what I want out of the instrument. And it usually takes people a very, very long time to get there. There are a lot of books that talk about the basics of things or go into great specific detail, but not a lot that sort of just talk about this whole integrated kind of a thing. So the first system is going to be tension. The second is going to be really about the physicality of the guitar, which is kind of back to that idea about if you can get it to do what you want, that's great. You want to make it sort of a little bit hard to play so that it actually energizes the guitar. If it's too low and too buzzy, too easy to press down, there's not anything the tension is not working for you. On the other hand, if you're fighting it too hard, then you can't do what you want to do. So there comes, a bit of trial and error that everybody has to go through with string gauges and how their guitar is set up. There's also the question of scale length, the speaking length of the string from the nut to where it stops here. Different companies have different lengths, different attributes. A longer scale length, typically with maybe a company like Fender, is going to be noted for having a tighter, twangier sort of a sound, more of a taut bass, maybe more piano-like. Chords are going to tend to have more of an articulate individual note sound. The shorter scale lengths are going to have a looser feel, maybe be easier to bend on, a little softer sound, and their chords are going to sound more homogeneous. You're going to get this sort of blended sound, and that can be both a decision in terms of the sound and also just somebody's hand size and innate flexibility and that sort of thing. But that's what that brings to the table largely, is articulation versus warmth and integration of sound. And then people also kind of argue a lot about how the neck is attached. Sort of one camp that's all about necks being glued in, and another camp that's maybe all about necks being bolted on. And in general, between those two, if that's the only variable that you changed, if I took this neck and glued it in or bolted it in and the neck joint was equally tight, there's not a significant difference. There's so much going on between some of the other variables in those two main camps of guitar, between maybe a Fender derived design slab body bolt-on thing and a Gibson multiple layer design with a dovetail joint, and the different scaling. That's more the critical thing is more in those other elements, not so much in the bolt-on. A neck through body where the spar of the neck would go all the way through and connect to the bridge, that's going to be more different for sure, and it brings out more fundamental and a little bit less attack. Tends to have a smoother tone and is more popular with basses than guitars. So as you're looking at this idea, then you start to look at the wood, and that again, a very, very heavy, bright, aggressive wood like maple or heavy ash, it's going to skew the recipe towards a quicker attack, more snap, probably not as much warmth, a different sort of sustain, more of a splash and impact kind of sustain, almost like a cymbal that you hit, and then a ring, as opposed to a lower follow through like a deeper, richer wood like maybe mahogany or walnut or something like that. All of these things, you could sort of look at it like a recipe. You can't make chocolate chip cookies without salt, but salt is just a tiny little thing in there, so it takes a long time to figure out what the most important parts of the recipe are to use. Some people, their ear really, really favors a certain wood, or some people, maybe the big determining factor for them is going to be the scale length. They just have to have the warmth of the shorter scale length, or have to deal with the articulation of the longer scale length. So there's a little bit of ramping up in there, and listening to a lot of guitars that'll sort of inform you about that. And then, the electronics, the idea there is, in guitars, typically they're subtractive. They're not adding anything. These controls are not being powered. Some basses and some modern guitars have little preamps, but for the most part, this is really all about taking away. So you're looking at these as a capture mechanism, and then this just feeding how much of it you want down, and sometimes there'll be a tone control that will just roll off the high end and allow you to warm up the sound, but you're still not, this is really not as critical as the wood and this, and it's the final thing. And in general, there's so much that people switch out once you get this right. Once you get a body shape that works for you, once you get a scale length that works for you, a wood recipe that works for you, the electronics are so easy to swap in and out that once you get the rest of it right, you can actually take the same guitar and play in a heavy metal band for 6 months with pickup load A, and then switch to a country band and put pickup load B in there, maybe change string gauge, and that same guitar can easily work for you in that circumstance. But if you don't get the beginning right, you really don't have any chance of getting that true magic thing, which is having first a guitar that's well crafted, where you're not losing any energy. The fit and the finish is tight. The neck is really tightly integrated to the body, and the balance of the woods are very, very good. The body is not overpowering the neck. The neck is not dominating over the body. Everything's in balance. Then you've got metal in the recipe, to a lesser degree, obviously, than wood. You've got a metal bridge in most electric guitars. You've got keys. Occasionally you'll find somebody that'll run a brass nut. And there is something to be said for what these materials are made out of. You could, typically you have aluminum or steel or brass being the most common metals, and aluminum is going to be, as you would imagine, you think about it being a lightweight metal. It's going to have maybe a more open, acoustic, ringy kind of a sound. Brass has a nice low push, and steel has a very aggressive character. And so those are not as small as salt, but not as big as wood in the recipe. And so you start to, and those things are also interchangeable at this point. Most of the basic guitar designs are so many different parts that you can buy to experiment with once you establish what your basic instrument is. Are you going to play a Les Paul type of instrument? Are you going to play a Strat type of instrument? Those are all recipes. You could buy a Les Paul that's made by Hamer, or a Strat that's made by Tom Anderson. It's really a formula. It doesn't have to be made by the original manufacturer, the original brand. But those formulas are pretty well adhered to, so you have pickups that you can swap in, you have hardware that you can swap in. There are lots of different ways to work with the controls, and for the large portion, that's a lot of what I do, is really getting this final fit of customer and guitar. And the idea really comes down, in my thinking with the controls, to whether you're somebody that likes to play around with things while you're making music, or whether you want to get it right at the beginning of the deal and maybe just make it a little bit louder, a little bit softer, switch a little bit between pickups to change the voice, or whether you're going to be somebody that really wants to touch the guitar all the time while you're playing. Two completely valid perspectives, and I've heard people argue all the time, it should all be in your hands, or you're not really using your electric guitar if you're not constantly working with all the options you have. I have no definitive answer on that. I see people, get a lot out of it either way. But that's really what changing this stuff is about for the most part. Once you get up to high quality parts, it's really about, do you want something that's really stripped down and simplified? And do you have something really idiosyncratic about the way that you play? Do you need something that you can tap on and off and cut the thing in and out and make a certain sound effect? Or are you going to run a very bright sound all the time? Do you have some particular thing? But otherwise, the switching significance is really just to make it convenient for you to get to the whatever basic tones that it is that you want. And a part of it that people sometimes kind of either take too seriously or make fun of, but I don't see a lot of people really get the impact of it correct, is the guitar looks a certain way and has a certain size and shape that's going to fit your body. Probably if you play in a country band or you play in a big praise and worship band, you're not going to get away with a pointy guitar that has skulls on it. But you should go to the music store and play the pointy guitar with skulls, because maybe it's a neck through body with active pickups and you've never played a telly that had neck through body with active pickups, and maybe what you need is a telly with a neck that goes through the body and active pickups. So, that is a kind of silly thing that, why would I play a pink guitar? Why would I play a pointy guitar? But there's something to learn from all of them, and there's a reason, even if you're a little fairly small stature person, you're not going to play maybe a Gibson 335 where you'd be hiding behind it trying to reach over the top of it. Or I had a buddy that I used to tech for, that was 6'5", weighed about 370 or something like that, and he would play a 335 and it looked like a mandolin. And there was he had no interest in playing tellies, even though he played blues. He had no interest in Strats or tellies, because it just felt ridiculous and looked ridiculous. And so there are some reasons why that stuff is definitive, and you're not going to get away with the pointy BC Rich in your praise and worship band, likely. But it's important to play them all and learn the lessons that they can contribute, because there's a reason why all the designs, if they've been out for any length of time, they've worked for a number of people. So there's something to be learned from it. People talk about sort of big three things. They talk about tone, they talk about vibe, and they talk about action when they talk about how much they like a guitar. And action, most people really simplify it to think about how high are the strings off of there? How hard is it to press down? And I would kind of like to expand that to the idea of the minimum height that a guitar can have the strings set above the frets with that particular player's choice of strings and with that particular player's technique. Because I can set a guitar up for one person that's a big basher that's going to play 11s, and they're going to have it, way up in the air, and the same person playing the same guitar would be able to get it to play without buzzing at a very, very, very tiny, fraction of that height above. So it's really important to sort of get a feel for what is high action in terms of the strings, but also how does that, what all goes into that, because if you change the relief on the neck without changing the height here, it does change completely the feel and the height. You could set it to 2 or 3 30 seconds here and take a couple of turns out of the truss rod, adding bow, and the action is going to increase to 4 or 30 seconds. Get the neck totally flat, it might drop down all the way to 2 or a little under 2 without even changing the height here. So somebody brought up the point earlier about the idea about going to a Guitar Center or some big store where you can play a lot of the same model, play 15 Strats that are ostensibly the same model, even pare them down to the ones that are alder bodies and rosewood fingerboards or something like that. And if you did that, you would likely come up with one that was your favorite, one that's your winner. So that in and of itself is kind of interesting, because that suggests that even though these guitars just came out of the same factory, had the same factory strings on them, are supposedly made out of the same wood, the same components, one of them stands out to you as being clearly the best. You come back the next day with your friend, and your friend is going to choose number 3 when you chose number 7. So it's not even that you're establishing one that is, for any discernible, quantifiable, specific reason, the best for everybody in the whole world. So the key is to figure out what that is that makes number 7 ideal for you. And then as you start to find those elements, you say, well, okay, a lot of that is because that neck's really flat. I like that really big snappy thing. So then when you go to play another guitar and it doesn't feel right to you, you can look at it and you can do a quick assessment of the relief and say, oh, maybe this guitar would be great for me if it had 2 turns on the truss rod and the neck wasn't all bowed out. Same thing with string gauges. You go in and you play somebody's guitar and they've got 11s on there and you always played 9s, and you think, I like the way this guitar sounds, but I could never play this guitar. It might be as simple as they have a hugely different set of strings on there or something like that. Being able to identify those things that really make a difference to you, and then really look for that as you play other people's guitars, or as you're out playing guitars in stores and things like that, or as you're requesting your tech or whoever to try and help you get your guitar to work better for you. The more that you are in tune with what those variables do, your guitar changes overnight and feels like the action is higher. Well, your bridge didn't miraculously move. L's didn't come in the night and unscrew your bridge. Your neck is reflecting the changes in temperature and humidity. So just knowing that simple fact, and that will help you stay in touch with what's going on with your guitar a lot. So action is really largely getting it to respond acoustically the way that you want it to play as fast as you want it to play with as much buzz or as little buzz as you're willing to accept, to handle your type of technique the way that you want to hit the guitar and have it respond. Do you want it to be soft and absorb the energy that you put into it? Do you want it to snap back immediately when you hit it hard? And to do that as easily as possible, to achieve whatever that is that you want out of the guitar as easily as possible. That's action. So good action is it does what you want it to without hurting your fingers, basically. That's good action. And those things are, you can adjust this up and down to get the strings higher or lower. The truss rod is going to govern where the amount of relief happens and how much that is. So that's going to give you more snap or more of a rubbery, softer sound. It's going to govern where buzz happens on the neck, if it's going to happen, and how much there is. How old the strings are. Can you hear dead strings? Do you hear that thump that's dead string as opposed to that thump that's too much finish, or wood that's pretty lame, that's too wet, or too young? Starting to kind of get in touch with those things and develop a little bit of a sophistication, not necessarily for recognizing it in everybody else's playing, but for recognizing it in what you're trying to do. When you have a guitar in your hands, why isn't it doing exactly what you want? Boom, it needs a truss rod adjustment. Boom, it needs different strings. Boom, the pickups are too far away. Different things like that. That will arm you with the ability to, assess guitars really quickly. When you're trying to record with somebody else's guitar, you're trading guitars with somebody at a jam or something like that. When you're thinking about buying a guitar, makes a huge difference. And just as your taste changes, 6 months ago this guitar felt great. Now it doesn't. Why doesn't it? Is it something that's actually changed in the guitar, or is it something that's changed in what you want out of the guitar, or what you're trying to get from the guitar? And if so, where do you go to get that to happen? So that kind of covers what action is, and kind of a little bit about thinking about action. Tone, of course, is the word in the industry. Tone, whether it's amps or pedals or whatever, that's everything. And to me, that's kind of the voice of the instrument, and I really try and think about it before the electronics, and then bring the electronics into it. And when I'm setting up a guitar, I drop the pickups really, really low so that there's no way that the magnets are interfering with the strings, so I can really listen to just the first system, just the tension in the wood. And I get that working as well as it can possibly happen. Then I'll bring up the bridge pickup, which has a harder time working because the strings are so taut back here that the string just doesn't have much room to move through this magnetic field. So typically, if you had a matched set of pickups, even on this, which is a really high-end matched set of pickups, the bridge pickup is much higher than the neck pickup, much closer to the strings. That's because this doesn't have as much energy to work with. This is just, has a lot of string charging through there. So you bring this up to the point where you feel like you're hearing something really good happen. You listen up here on the neck and make sure that the magnets are not actually starting to pull the string, because there's another bit of that balancing thing. You want the magnets close to the string because that's what they're supposed to be doing, is listening to the string and counting what's going on in there. As you bring them closer, it gets louder and louder and louder, and you get very excited, but you find that if all you're doing is listening to the open string and you fret something high on the neck, you can have that magnet completely distorting what this string is supposed to be doing in terms of its elliptical path, and you can have it pull it out of tune up here. You can have it actually pull it into buzzing off of the higher frets. So the first thing to do then is to sort of bring it up and find the sweet spot, the best sound that you can get out of the bridge pickup. And then this one has so much to work with that you sort of bring it in behind to match in with that. And I usually do that just by kind of hitting the lower and the higher strings, tilting this back and forth, bringing the low side up and the high side up until I really feel like that's doing everything that it can do. And then I'll come down here and go back and forth between them, comparing the output until I feel like I've got something that it's a pretty good balance, usable balance. Listen to them together, and then make sure that that this one is not really completely sacrificing by being as far away. Sometimes in some sets you'll find that they're not balanced well enough, and this one is so close to the same output that it has to be buried into the front of the fingerboard or into the top of the guitar, and it's so far away that it doesn't sound very good. So then you have to kind of trade off the idea about this one being in its sweet spot, which one is more important, and just balance them. But treating this whole thing as a separate unit, I think, really helps you establish what's going on with the tone. And you can't have the true magic without both things being right, but you can't fix it with pickups. You can change the character a lot with pickups, and you can take a marginal guitar and for a moderate investment make a huge difference. But magic, it all has to work, and the wood, you can't fake it with the pickups. You can get some magic, and a lot of players that have really strong personalities on the instrument can make a not great set of pickups or a not great amp sound really pretty amazing, but you can't do much with a guitar where the wood is not very good and the integration of the parts and the fit and finish is not very good. Can't really fake that. Can't get the magic without that. And since this is something that's so easy to change over time, really you want to get in touch with this. I practice a lot and have always practiced a lot on whichever my main electric guitar is, unamplified. You can't do it exclusively or you lose touch with how your rig works, and you don't know how your amp works, and you don't know how your pedals work, and you feel really foolish when you go on stage and turn everything up and everything's howling and feeding back and you can't find things. But I think part of the magic is also to be found in playing the instrument unamplified in a nice quiet spot and really listening to what it has to say, and then looking at this as something which is going to capture that, put its little spin on it, and then give you a way of making it appropriate for the level that you need to, for what you got going on around you. And then the final one is going to be, sort of the vibe that we talked about in terms of the look of it. Is it, something that's associated with a particular genre or a particular player? I find between bass players and guitar players are more concerned with the heroes. The instrument's a little bit older than the bass, and so there are some really more established heroes. You've got your Stratocaster has its people, your Les Paul has its people, and so they're a little bit more into that idea of, I want a guitar that looks like what my hero played, beyond even knowing that it's going to sound like it, because it's not going to sound like it, and because they probably didn't use it when they recorded in the studio. You see this person play every single gig, and they're playing a Les Paul, and you find out that Stairway to Heaven was cut on a Telecaster. So that's the classic example of that one. He loved his Les Pauls, but that classic solo was a Telecaster, and it wasn't a Marshall. So that's its own thing. But it is, you want to feel like it. If you want to play in a blues band, you don't want that pointy guitar. There are not that many guys that really want that pointy guitar in a blues band. So there is something to be said for that vibe, and then people like that vintage vibe too. Fender's making a lot of money selling those relic instruments. And at first I thought that was kind of silly. Why would I pay, $2,000 more to have somebody whip up my guitar? Why not just, I'll just carry it without a case for a year and be fine. But I began to understand as I was selling those when they first came out that for a lot of people, they want that history. They like that history. They're fascinated with the age of it and all that the guitar's been through, and this golden age of craftsmanship and this unobtainable smaller quantity of things that are receding every day. And, so that vibe was really important, and for some people that was they would much rather have bought a Fender Custom Shop Relic with the distressed look than maybe a arguably better built Tom Anderson or something like that was maybe more whip tight, and everything was a little bit more functional and might be arguably a better machine. But for that person, that little mojo, that little thing of feeling like, this is this piece of history, this is exactly what so-and-so would have played, this is what it would feel like if it had been out there for all that time, that made a big difference to them. And there are some intangibles like that, and so that's part of the magic. It would be hard for me I don't do pointy, I don't do things that poke me and jab me. I had a Parker Fly for a little while that was an amazing machine. And it was a buddy's that I was teching for, and he had some really rare example that was all 27A flame maple, and it was just hard to look at. And it was the most excruciating Parker Fly of all time. Should have been the greatest guitar, and it made me respect the design a great deal, and made me really fascinated with Ken Parker. But I hated the guitar personally because it was pokey. It was always getting after me. And so one of the things when I started building a lot of guitars was I took cutouts of whatever my prototypes were going to be, and they were not radically different. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel, but one of the things I was going for was this feeling of comfort and not jarring things. So I would take modeling clay and put it on a template of the guitar, a wooden frame of the guitar, and I would stick it on my buddy that's 6'5" and 370, say, hold this thing and jump around with us while we play. And I would look at all the parts of that guitar that were smushed by his body. And then I would give it to the other guy who was, a little tiny bony guy, and I'd stick it on him and say, okay, you play this for a while. Give me little chicken wing marks over here. And, and all of a sudden I started to see, okay, everybody's body is coming into contact with the guitar here, and nobody's is coming into contact with it over here. And where does it fight you? People have all kinds of different ideas about how to get more, a heel that's shaved off or something here, things to make the guitars play better and have more access. And that's what I did, was just try a bunch of different body types and just look for ways that you could have a more physically comfortable guitar. Other people, they drop that Parker fly down, they put it on their hip, they tilt it a little bit forward like that, and it weighs 4 pounds, and they're like, I would never play anything else. Are you crazy? The neck doesn't move, the frets are stainless steel. How could you play any other guitar? So, I couldn't sell out as much as I'm into the geeky science part of guitars. I couldn't sell out on the Parkers for that reason. Sold a ton of Parkers to people that would never play anything else. So you have to allow yourself a little bit of that, even to the extent that it maybe is not practical to pay that extra $2,000 to have them beat the thing with chains, or if you've got a big wood fetish and 5A flame maple doesn't sound better than regular maple. It just looks great. But if it's going to make you feel like that guitar is that special because it has that fancy maple, then if you're going for the magic, that's worth it. I personally am a big fan of finding a guitar that's used that sounds good acoustically, that you can tug on and pull on and does what you want it to do, doesn't go out of tune, feels really stable, and then you have a lot of fun with it. And you do as much of it as you want. You work with a tech for the stuff that you're not comfortable with. I think most people should be able to adjust their truss rods, adjust their pickups, set their intonation, all the basic stuff like that. There are enough books out there. There's really not anything you can foul up other than if you really crank on a truss rod too hard, and you have to want it. You have to want it. I've only broken one in 30 years or something like that, and that was when I was really young, and I wanted it. I pulled on that thing until it creaked and groaned and creaked and groaned. I still wanted more, and then it snapped. And I said, okay, I'm not ever going to do that again. And for a while, I didn't adjust my truss rod, and then I went back to it. Of course, it's long before I went to school for this stuff, but you shouldn't be afraid of them. Everybody has a point at which their fascination is going to run out. A lot of really great musicians that I've worked with, could barely tie their strings on. Or I would have to give them punishment for tetanus shots for me having to, cut the stuff off in little pieces, and it's all wrapped around there, rusty and crusty and everything. Not everybody wants to do a lot of their own work, but if you just get the basic stuff under control, then you can take care of yourself and get yourself out of a lot of trouble and really understand what's going on. And then just keep on that path of trying to listen and trying to get closer to it all the time, trying to refine what it is that you're going for. That sensation of attack is a lot of it. What the guitar does when you attack it. Does it spring back at you? Does it snap? Does it sag in a little bit and then explode out? Does it just sag in and just mostly hang out in the low stuff? Does it hang out in the mud like a hippopotamus, or does it just rip back out at you? And just really taking the time to do that rather than spending a lot of time online looking at reviews on Harmony Central. You can teach yourself so much more, by just having a couple of guitars around, and get a cheap one that you're not afraid of, so that if you do want it too badly and crank on the truss rod, you shouldn't really do that. But even if you do, if you just get a cheap second guitar to work around with, there's a lot to be gained from that. And just not being afraid of them, and just thinking about them as they work all the way around as the couple of systems. Drop the pickups out of the way, listen to it. What is it really doing unamplified? Take the time to listen to different strings. Picks are a gigantic thing. People overlook picks all the time. They just think, I want a thin one because it's easy to work with. I want a little tiny one because I drop the big ones. I want one that's hard because it sounds mean and nasty. But if you just had that jar full of picks when you went to record, you wouldn't have to change guitars. You could change picks and get a bunch of different sounds out of the same guitar. Same thing with strings. Their strings are made in, it's not that big a matrix. There's core material, whether it's round or hex core, that's just basically establishes whether it's more or less flexible. And people argue the life because of how the hex core strings can grip a little bit tighter. People argue that the round core are a little bit more flexible and truer to intonate. But there's only a couple of different formulas. You've got pure nickel, you've got nickel-plated steel, you've got all steel, you've got a couple of people that make them in hex core, round core. You could take a couple of weeks per string and in 6 months have listened to every single string that would be reasonable for your guitar and your approach. And again, one of those is going to be a winner. I would never play anything for myself other than Tomastics because the clean sound is that much better. And they're really expensive, and that's, if I'm ever not owning a music store getting them at cost, it's probably going to be a sad day for me to have to pay, $20 to chop for electric guitar strings. But for me, that was huge. Other people could care less. It's only in the gauge. I don't care that much about the gauge. I just want the material right. So, you find those things out for yourself. But you do yourself a great bit of justice to do those experiments. Get a bunch of picks. Get a bunch of different kinds of strings. Get a basic book on guitar setup. And just tweak around with your guitar with the idea in mind that there's really not much you can do that you can break, and anything that you get yourself into in the world of setup, any reasonable tech is going to get you out of for a bench hour. You can have your pickups dropped in there, you can break wires in there because you mucked around with something too much. You can get your neck where you're not sure whether it was more or less relief and the intonation is all out, and any reasonable tech can correct that in less than an hour. So you really should be pretty free to float. And to do that kind of experimenting on your own. And you owe it to yourself to have a magic guitar if you like guitar playing, even if you don't play that often, or even if you're not trying to play professionally. If you enjoy playing guitar, you're going to enjoy playing guitar worlds more if you've got a guitar that's really receptive to what you're doing, and where you don't have the frustration of fighting it in any way, shape, or form, and it's just right there to do exactly what you're wanting to do. And people have been 50 years plus is enough to get the basics under control. There's a guitar out there for just about everybody, and if you're doing something really fringe and you require something really exotic, there's somebody that's doing it. And especially now that you can interact with people all over the world super quickly, you should be able to do that. You should be able to have a guitar with relative ease that does pretty much exactly what you want. It just takes that little bit of work on your part of figuring out what it is that you want, and then being willing to go after it a little bit, and just decide how much of it you want to do yourself, how much of it you want to spend money for somebody else to do. That depends certainly on the person, but the willingness to do it is what it takes. And if you're not, then you don't get the magic guitar. And if you are, then it doesn't matter if you play 2 nights a week or sit around in your chair strumming watching the football game. It's going to be a lot more rewarding. And if you are somebody that's even just playing in a regional band or a local band or playing in church on Sunday morning, to know that your guitar is going to do exactly what you want. It's not going to short out. It's not going to be out of tune. It's not going to fight you when you want to step out and do that extra little special thing. It's going to be right there for you when you feel like that inspiration to try something new. It's going to be right there coasting along with you. It's going to support you and do what you want it to do. You owe it to yourself to do that if you have that in you, if you have that desire to play music on a guitar. And the electric guitar can do so many things. You could easily, with technology now, you could cut a whole album in your house and do all the drum sounds, all the keyboard sounds, all the bass sounds, all the horn sounds, derived from this as a controller. You don't even have to think about having a keyboard as a controller anymore. You can link these up to all kinds of things, and there's so much you can do with electric guitars now. They're such a simple starting point, and they're so easy to work with. They're portable and they're light and they're friendly, and everybody all over the world seems to like them. People play electric guitar music, and all kinds of different styles of music have been translated to electric guitars, and electric guitars have been modified, with all kinds of drone strings played slide if you're in India, and people have modified them to play gamelan music on, and just music from all over the world. It just seems to be a very functional sort of machine. So I think that's pretty much the flow of consciousness version of my outline here.
Nice.
Yeah, I think the last little summation thing, you can't argue with the physics except when it conflicts with your taste. So, bigger neck, bigger strings, better sound unless you can't control it. So you can't argue with the physics that it will happen. It does happen. Bigger strings make the guitar ring longer, but if you can't do the thing you want with them, then it doesn't help. What you sound like by yourself, that's, I guess, the final thing to cover, is not what you sound like in context. And that's kind of the last tripping up spot, and that is a really tough one to learn. The ideal guitar for you sitting around by yourself is not always going to be the ideal guitar in a particular context. So that can be something where you might have to have a second guitar for some things, or where over time you might, if you're going from your heavy metal band to your country phase or whatever, where pickups can swap out and that sort of thing. But also, you have to take a little bit of time to realize that whatever you dial up on the guitar, whatever you dial up on the amp by yourself, or playing along with something that you're practicing at the house, is not necessarily going to be the ideal sound in context. And that can hurt, because you can spend an awful lot of time getting everything perfect and then throw it into a mix with an organ and a drum and 5 people playing tambourine and where's my guitar? Or you can come out with the most wonderful wide range frequency, represents everything, and you can't hear anything else in the band. And everybody's really, really not impressed with your wonderful wide frequency range thing because you can't hear anything else in the band. So you still have to get out and do a lot of that kind of legwork too. You have to hear it in context. You can't hole up and just woodshed your tone exclusively and then expect to unleash it on the world and have it be perfect in every context. So as much as I try and get people to do the experimenting themselves and not do it all by listening to reviews and things like that, you also have to get out and play with people to be able to see how it really is going to function. Even if you're sitting around and you've got a home recording system of some sort, it's still not the same thing as live drums. Live drums change everything. And big organs change a lot of things. Lots of people singing background vocals, create a whole different sort of, pitfall. Lots and lots of cymbals. You get a drummer that's always up here like that, and your mid-range is no longer your own. So it can be that in and of itself is a whole other thing. And any one of these things that interests a person. I touched briefly on neck joints. My goodness, there are people that will argue that all day long. There are people that argue about the value of every little component in here. There's somebody that's written a book or will argue all day long about it, and they all have valid points, except the ones that are completely loony. But everybody else they have valid points. But it really still gets down to the same thing. You can't argue with the physics until it gets in the way of my tone. Some people want a squonky tone. I mean, think about Neil Young. Neil Young has a really squonky, scratchy tone a lot of the time. Neil Young could afford any guitar in the whole world. He could afford a symphonic sound. That's not what he hears. That's not what he feels. That's not what he wants to project. So if I was to go in there and try and set his guitar up to be pristine, he would beat me with that guitar because there would be the taste and the intent arguing with the physics. I could make his guitar probably play better and sound less scratchy with different things or different amp, but my goodness, it wouldn't be a Neil Young. It wouldn't carry that emotion. It wouldn't be appropriate for him at all, and I would deserve to be beaten with the guitar. So you can certainly delve into this to any degree. There's worlds to go on about pickups. Everybody in the whole world makes pickups, and there's so many different things about the different magnets and the different strengths, different woods, different scalings. Everybody has their thing, but the basic thing is it's a fairly simple system. A couple of things that are unarguable about what happens with the scale length, about bigger components, heavier wood, darker wood, harder wood, louder pickups, but basically that's all contributing to getting the sound that you want, and that ultimately at the end of the day is really the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter what it sounds like to anybody else, how it feels to anybody else. It doesn't matter if nobody else can play your guitar. It doesn't matter if nobody else even really likes your guitar tone. As long as what's happening there is what you want, it's saying what you want to say, and it's doing it in a way that is sort of letting it happen and not a struggle, then that's it. That's the magic. That's the thing you're trying to achieve. So, questions?
Yeah. Thank you.
I have one. I just have always noticed that there's some people that play, and I've never owned an electric guitar, just a couple acoustic guitars, but I noticed that half of them are hollow and half of them aren't. Is there a common? Does that actually make a definitive change?
It does, and it does a couple of things, and there are a lot of things that go on inside them that it's not just hollow guitars and not hollow guitars. Like this one looks like it would be, but it's got a big block down the middle. So really these are just chambers on the sides. Some of them, like the jazz guitars, some of those are completely hollow. Some of them even have just tone posts like a violin or a cello would have. Some of them are blocked in the middle or have, sort of things that sculpt down the middle where the contact points are. And basically what you're doing is you're trying to bring in more of a delicate sound of wood, not the forceful hit of an electric guitar through a big amplifier just punching at you. And you're trying to bring in more of the sort of stringy sound where you can hear the wound strings scraping against the frets a little bit, and the glassiness of these strings, where you're trying to bridge that gap between some of the nuance that is lost in just bolting two things together, throwing some pickups on there, and having it go. You lose a little nuance there in some respects. You're trying to bridge that gap. So it does make a big difference. In a practical standpoint, they're going to be a little bit bulkier. They're going to be more prone to feedback. You're not going to get away with playing Metallica on a guitar that's hollow. A lot of people that do play heavier sounds or louder sounds have their hollow body guitars stuffed with things. Maybe they like the physicality of it, and maybe when they record, but some people will shoot foam into them to deaden that top a little bit and to keep the air from moving around like that. Some people will stuff cloth and things into it. Some people do it as a permanent mod, or some people will only do it when they're playing live where things are just lit up and really loud, and maybe when they record they might have another one that they take the stuff out of. You see them typically with people that do not play heavily distorted stuff, typically jazz or blues, sometimes country, but more often jazz and blues. And there's kind of two things. There's a semi-hollow, like a 335, Gibson 335 would be kind of an iconic one, or some of the derivatives like B.B. King plays a 355, or what they call the Lucille model, which is just one without F-holes, which changes the look and also changes the way that it feeds back slightly. And those are not super thin, not super thick, and they are the tops are not carved. Like a good acoustic guitar is going to have a solid piece of wood, not plywood. A really expensive jazz guitar is going to have a carved top. It's going to be a single piece of wood that's been carved to a very, very thin. That brings out that very delicate, nuanced kind of a thing. The hybrid guitars, like a 335, are a laminate, and they're a little bit deader. They don't have quite the nuance. They kind of split the difference. You can crank them up a little bit more. Somebody like Larry Carlton played some pretty distorted fusion lead stuff on there, but his rhythm stuff is usually pretty clean. And they're definitely sort of the third category of guitars. People usually say, one category of guitar is maybe the Gibson Les Paul. Another category might be the Fender Strat. Tellys are great, but they're not as universally accepted as the Strat. The third one might be something like the 335 or some kind of a hollow body, and maybe the fourth one would be something with a Floyd Rose tremolo, where that was a really big feature, was having that really aggressive control over the string bending. But that's definitely one of the family trees, and it's a really cool. A 335 is a really versatile guitar because you can rock out pretty hard on them, but you still get some of that feel, both physically because it's wider and bigger, and it just sits on you more like an acoustic guitar. So definitely something fun. If you have, could easily be the Magic guitar, could also be something where you can't make a Strat turn into one of those. So a lot of people, if you're going to collect a handful of guitars to try and be able to make all the sounds, you've established what your main sound is, but you still want to make the sounds. That's one of the sounds, is a 335 or some sort of a semi-hollow jazz box. The really expensive, beautiful arch top carved, $15,000 and up guitars, that's the high art of guitar building. There is none higher. That's hand carved, really hardcore violin type construction. And those guys, Benedetto and things like that, those guitars can be as much money as you want to spend. I mean, $100,000, you can commission a guitar built for $100,000 easily. And that's art and craftsmanship of the highest order. And those are things where, there really isn't anything that's more sophisticated than that sort of craftsmanship.
You said some really great things about setup and feel. Do many of those things change with the bass guitar, or is it mostly?
Oh, basses are wonderful. Basses are my favorite, actually. Yeah, I started on bass, and if the ship is sinking and I have to jump into one lifeboat, I'm jumping in with the bass players. Basses are harder to get to do, particularly 5-string and beyond. 4-string basses, a jazz bass is kind of like a Strat. It's pretty much, the design is there for a lot of people. That's all you need, and you can play with the pickups. In general, yes. Truss rod is the same. There's still some people attack if you're a slap player or play heavy pick kind of stuff. you do have some considerations as far as the impact of what you're doing with your right hand or your left hand. If you're left-handed, your picking hand, your attack hand. You have a longer neck, so and a bigger string, so you're going to have more string excursion over a longer path. So getting the relief right is more finicky. I think in general they're harder to set up. I can probably set up a guitar more easily without seeing the player than I could set up a bass. Because if you're a little bit off on the bass, it's going to be really hard to play, or it's going to be really, really buzzy. But I can set up most guitars with a little bit of relief, 2 30-seconds, make sure the pickups aren't grabbing anything, the net's clean, and everything's happy down here, and hand it to a guitar player, and they're going to go, that's really cool. They might say, can we get it a little bit lower? Or they, okay, yeah, I really hit a little bit harder than that. But for the most part, you can kind of, get right in the middle, and most people are at least happy with it as a starting point. But the basics are there, but it's just harder. You're covering this wide frequency range. You've got a longer thing. The physicality is longer, so it just makes sure you're working harder. Your hands are working harder. You're stretching out more. So what happens down here, there's a lot of art in what happens with the nut. If the nut is if the slots for the nut are not deep enough, then not only is it uncomfortable down here, but it also pulls sharp down here. But as soon as you get that nut slot just a hair bit too low, that open string is going to rattle and buzz. Much harder to get that exactly right, it feels like to me, to nail that for a bass player. And also we play the open low strings more often with an aggressive attack. So in general, yes, I just think it's a little bit harder and takes a little bit more finesse, just because I think, especially when you start trying to get something where the low B is going to work and a high G or even a high C on a 6-string bass, you start getting into the modern expanded range basses. That's much, much harder. I think harder to engineer the instruments as well. You start dealing with, you need a longer scale length to get the B to happen, but I think to a certain extent, for my ear, I think 34 starts to sound harsh on a G. So I'm a big fan of fan frets. I don't own a fan fret bass right now, but fan frets, I think. Anybody up on the fan frets?
What's a fan fret?
You're all about the fan frets, I'm sure.
I made one once.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Sweet. What did you?
A lot of work.
Yeah. What did you think though about the result?
I think for a guitar it's kind of awkward because you can have your fingers in one position for a chord and then they kind of sort of transitions.
Yes, I think there would definitely be a learning curve, and I found. Even with basses, I found the chord thing was much harder. The static positions were harder than the. Basically, the idea is there's a guy, Curtis Novak, luthier and inventor and sort of genius kind of a guy, had a lot of people coming to him and they would say the same sort of things over and over again. Oh, I just love my SG. God, it's just so buttery up here, but oh, I love my Strat. It's so articulate down here. So he got this idea that what they were really focusing on was the scale length. They can bend all over this SG, but the bottom end is muddy. Or they can twang out, and the low end, they can tune their Strat down to D, and they can play all this articulate stuff down there. But when they go to bend, they have to really fight it. So he said, well, what if each string had its own scale length? So what that looks like is this fret would, instead of being parallel, would be like this, canted over here. And I think, there are different people who have different formulas for how far they're offset, and also it depends on, you would offset a bass more than a guitar because, you don't want something that's turned like this. But basically, I think he started with something that went from, 24.5 to 25.5 or something like that. I'm not sure what his initial ones were. But you do that, and it sort of goes like a windshield wiper, and at some point, depending upon where the offset is, it doesn't arbitrarily happen at the 12th fret. Where that offset happens, there'll be one fret that is essentially perpendicular, and then you start back down the same way. Makes a lot of sense. If I'm holding my hand like this and I'm trying to play that chord, and then I come up like this, my hands are making that shape already. So I think it's probably the wave of the future. I think once he even released it for a while, he was licensing it and it was really expensive, and there were only certain companies that would, small shops that would do it as an upcharge. You'd pay, $2,000 more to have your custom bass have that, or, very, very few. And then eventually Dingwall basses up in BC are kind of the leading sort of mid-tier. They're not a one-person shop, but they're not a huge production. And their basses are really, really desirable, really expensive boutique basses that have stuck around for a long time and have a lot of celebrity players and endorsees and signature models. And a lot of companies still offer that as an upgrade. And he's released that where he doesn't charge alembic. If you're going to have an alembic bass, he doesn't charge alembic $1,500 licensing to do that. I had contacted them about doing that for me a while back. It's really interesting. It does feel there is a learning curve. I found it on bass all the way until the thing started changing here, and I found my upper register chords were having to be a little bit backwards, but I never owned one for long enough to revoice them. And from what I've heard, that once you just think, okay, this little portion of it is just going to be different, it's, if you don't look at it, it doesn't feel weird, and you can have this amazing, like the bass it's a 37-inch low B and a 34-inch high C on the 6th string. So the low B is better than just about anything, conceivable with a shorter scale, and yet the high G isn't. Like some of the modern basses that have really extended scalings, 35 or 36 on all the strings, the Gs are really taut and really harsh. They don't have that sweet thing for popping that where it just kind of doesn't do that. It's like clang, clang. So that can be kind of harsh. But the fan fret thing is, I think it's kind of how it should be. But there is going to be a learning curve, and when you look at it, it's freaky. I mean, you look down at it, oh, what am I supposed to do? How am I, and if you just don't look at it, it's really, really easy. It's really approachable. As I said, I agree with you. Some of the static position stuff would have to be done differently. There's no way I could make some of the chords that I wanted to make high on the bass with it being tilted backwards. But I thought, if I just had a week to turn it around and revoice it with, one of these fingers down low, I felt like, I could probably make that happen in pretty short order. And definitely the next bass that I build for myself, next time I have access to a full wood space again and can just start from, scraps and actually make something just completely ground up, it's going to be a fan fret bass for sure.
Well, we're running a little over time, so we should finish up. Let's have another round of applause for Chance. Thanks so much for coming.
Next meeting, November 30th, we'll have Amber Case, a cyborg anthropologist and tech consultant researching prosthetic culture. She studies the interaction between humans and computers and how our relationship with information is changing the way cultures think, act, and understand their worlds. In December 2008, she founded Cyborg Camp, an unconference on on the future of humans and computers. In 2010, she was named one of Fast Company's most influential women in tech.
All right.
Cool.
Great.
I'll be back.
So everybody's welcome to hang out for a little bit and have a beer.
I just want
We
to
wrap up and
I love
ask more
my
questions
babies.
if you want. And thanks so much for coming.
Like, I could wait for you to see me.